Welcome, welcome, welcome
A notable welcome to all you music lovers.
to something
What I like to call
Journey.
to the stage. It's all about music
Music.
and more.
Music.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back
Your host. Your host.
and our dad.
Brian.
Frasier.
Have fun.
All right, well, welcome everybody. I'm Brian Fraser, and this is Journey to the Stage. And I am really, really glad you tuned in today because we've got a special guest. I'm looking forward to diving into our conversation with the one and only Glen Phillips. Before we do, as an indie podcaster, I would love your help. My marketing budget consists of your kindness. And by that, I mean any reviews, ratings, follows, or subscribes you give wherever you listen helps the algorithm to kind of go to work for this podcast and helps other people find us. So for any good reviews, to show my gratitude, Glenn and I will come over and paint the trim on your house. And legal department says I have to say I'm just kidding. But anyway, I would appreciate it. So I'm super excited today to be joined by Glen Phillips. And if you're not familiar with Glen's work, he is a founding member, vocalist, and musician in Toad the Wet Sprocket. Glen is also one of my favorite songwriters and has an incredible body of work as a solo artist and has lots of other musical endeavors like the Mutual Admiration Society, Works Progress Administration. And we're going to be playing a beautiful song from Glen's latest solo album here in a bit. I've been listening to Glen's music for over 30 years now, and music that is very special to me personally has been in my listening rotation since the early 90s. So Glen, it's really great to have you here. Welcome to Journey to the Stage.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, how are you doing these days?
Getting by. And doing well, actually. Life is
Good.
kind of. I had about a 10-year post-divorce wobbly period, which was very exciting and interesting, but kind of on the other end of that now and starting to kind of normalize just having a new home and new
Yeah.
partner and new life. And it's been quite lovely to acclimate to that.
Beautiful.
Took
Well, then
me a
you-
while. It took me a while.
Yeah, and then you went through the whole thing, with that table breaking under you and the glass and the injury, and like you had a stretch where that must have been a rough stretch.
Yeah, but I mean, I think life is ultimately, it's rough stretches and then spaces in between. I think the thing I realized more and more, especially I think after I did a bunch of live casts during lockdown, and this community kind of formed around that. And so I know a lot more about what's going on with some of the audience, and it's weird to sit there and play for an audience. There was this one show where I realized like there was one person who just lost their parents in the front,
Wow.
another who was battling cancer, another who I think a sibling had just died, another whose father had died, another and I was thinking, okay, this is the trauma load of, or maybe not trauma load, but the active grief of the people
Yeah.
in the audience. And it's only because I know,
Right.
which means that every audience I've ever played in front of,
Mhm.
like someone is sick, someone's just been diagnosed, someone has just lost someone, and that's been a constant from the beginning, and a little more, I think, as we get older.
Mhm.
But to realize it's like the hard stretch or this or that, like everyone's carrying something. Absolutely,
Yeah.
everyone is carrying something. And I think in modern society, we carry these things alone most of the time. We're encouraged to kind of carry them alone and silently. And it's so much better if we, there's this teacher I know who talks about, everyone always says, hold it together. But what if we held it together? So in any event, yeah, there were some difficult years, but I also think, it's odd because on the one hand, you want to acknowledge that you've overcome some adversity or had some challenges or been through a rough spot. And on the other hand, I think as a writer or performer, it's less my job to, and I guess I'm reacting to my past because I feel like I have had a tendency to act like a victim, and I have a very fortunate life. And I am trying to really not cast myself as a victim and come out with more gratitude. Just the more the more real conversations I have with people about what's actually going on in their life, like
Yeah.
once they're done with the small talk, what's really going on, everybody's got something heavy. Everybody's
Yeah.
chewing on something big.
Mhm.
And I don't know, telling my story, if it helps other people be more open about theirs, I think it's useful. But if it's just me talking about my hard times, I get bored quickly now, which is probably some kind of growth.
Well, I think that's beautiful, and I really appreciate you sharing that. And I wonder if 20-something-year-old Glenn would have, touring the world would have thought of those things. And I think you're right, probably those life experiences. And I think perspective we get when we get older. You and I think I'm about 6 months older than you. I think our perspective does change quite a bit, especially once we've wrestled with our own fallibility, our own difficulties in life. So I can really appreciate what you shared. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, 20-year-old me was a little more solipsistic. I don't know. I mean, it's, I feel you get older and I mean, well, maybe you don't, but hopefully you open up a little and
Mhm.
start realizing that everyone else is also a real human being.
One of the things that I learned about you as I was doing my research is that you're a Rush fan, and you clicked up like 8 levels in my coolness book because I'm a huge Rush fan myself. I love Rush. I miss Rush.
Yeah.
I wish they would have been able to tour a little bit longer because my sons were just a little bit too young to take to a concert. I would have loved them to see Rush live because you probably have seen them. And I mean,
I never
what?
did.
Well, yeah, you probably were out on the road yourself. I was fortunate to see their second to last show.
They were a great band. And I'm not as much of a current Rush fan. They were
Mhm.
incredibly instrumental in my formative years.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I've said it before. Neil Peart taught me how to listen to lyrics, how
yeah.
to pay attention to a narrative in a song. I'd come from disco before I got into Rush. I think I did the kind of typical middle school kid, like deciding that disco wasn't cool anymore. I feel is a tragedy because it's amazing musically.
Mhm.
The grooves and the arrangements are phenomenal. The playing is fantastic, but it's not a great lyrical format. Disco will never be remembered for
Right.
its subtle poetry.
It is true.
Uh, and and Neil Peart, maybe not. I mean, Ayn Rand hasn't worn very well over the years,
Mhm. Yeah,
to
he did
say
go
the
through that
least.
period. Yeah.
He did go through that period, which can't be forgotten. But if I forgive him that, once again, just his intelligence and his insight, and that band totally changed what I thought music was capable of doing.
That's really cool. And it's interesting you talk about him as a lyricist. Of course, he's just, yeah, incredible. But I would say the same of you. I find you're actually one of my favorite lyricists and find you often
Thank
to
you.
be very poetic. And even today, as I was driving back, I was listening to The Sound of Drinking, and you use a phrase, the movement of the moon. Not to get ahead of myself, but I'm like, that is just that to me brought me to Paul. That sounds like something Paul Simon would write, even, which I don't know. It's just a really cool phrase. The movement of the moon. It's just it's a simple phrase, but it's beautiful too. I just think even those few words can really be evocative. I just really, really appreciate that.
Thank you. I was looking at this record and some of the songs, because these were all written for this, songwriting game that I play, that I'm involved in with Matt the Electrician and a bunch of other
Mm.
songwriters, right? All the songs are written from the title. Every
Okay.
week there's a song, and there's like 25 of us, and we all write a
Gotcha.
song from that title. So
Wow.
I've described it before as being kind of this Rorschach test of the title comes in, and then you see what's in there and what it becomes. So I was noticing in these, like, there's some of them that are like aggressively alliterative, uh, just meaning the movement of the moon,
Yeah,
not
I
rhymes,
love
but
that.
so much alliteration.
Going back, I didn't realize you were 15 years old when you guys started Toad the Wet Sprocket. And
Mhm.
by 17, you guys had been signed by Columbia. That I didn't know any of that. And I was
They're 18, but
18.
still, it was still young.
That's so crazy. Yeah, walk us through like those early days of, you guys getting together, playing music. What did you sound like initially? And I also learned you had an album that I never had, your very first one.
Oh, Bread and Circus.
I didn't even know that album existed. So this has been a learning experience for me. But anyway, kind of walk us through those kind of formative years.
Yeah, that album is basically how we sounded. I mean, we were all at San Marcos High School. They were all seniors. I was a freshman. We were in choir and theater together. So we did Thornton Wilder's Our Town.
Oh, yeah.
Todd, our guitarist, was the narrator, the lead in that. And then we did Oklahoma. Dean, the bass player, sang The Farmer and the Cowman Should Be Friends. So we were theater nerds in high school. And I found out that Todd lived 2 blocks from me. We had the same floor plan. It was the Thunderbird 2 development. He lived in a mirror image of my house. And so, but he was 2 blocks away, and he had this big green, wood paneled station wagon that I could throw my bike in. So I was lazy, and I got rides home from him and found out he could play the solo from Stairway to Heaven and licks from Boston song. Yeah, he had all the Boston licks down. And so I would go to his house and we started writing songs together. I would say it was my first band ever, but it was actually, I had a band called Destiny that played 1 show at my junior high school. That was a 3-piece where I starred as Geddy Lee. I played bass and sang, and we did a terrible. If Rush were utterly incompetent 8th grade musicians, you can just picture. The main thing I remember about our debut gig, we played at lunch in the theater, and I remember a chocolate milk carton exploding on my bass, someone chucking their milk. It wasn't great. So Toad was my second band. And we went through a few early iterations of trying to find a cool lead singer, who wasn't a greasy. I was a really nerdy freshman, and I was the temporary original singer. I used to play bass, actually. When Dean started playing with us, he played guitar and keyboards. He had this red Kramer guitar with the locking nut.
Oh, yeah, it was the 80s. Kramers were hot.
Yep, and I still have actually my bass. Wait, just a second. I still have my Aria Pro 2 Cardinal bass.
Let's that a little I think you should play a little YYZ for us.
Oh, just the...
Nice.
That was terrible. I'm back.
And he's back, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, so we started playing around town. We got lucky because there was this club near us called Pat's Grass Shack, and they were super cheap. He didn't believe in paying ASCAP or BMI. For the audience, if you don't know, ASCAP and BMI are the PROs. They're performance rights organizations that make it so that when music is played, the songwriters and the publishers get a little bit of money, right? So when radio plays a song, the songwriters are supposed to get paid. And if you walk into a club, you will see on the door a little ASCAP or BMI or CSAC sticker. And that means based on their capacity, they pay a blanket fee every month.
Oh, okay.
To performance rights associations, so that a band can go in there and play covers or play their own songs, and the band is supposed to get that money. This guy wouldn't pay ASCAP. He's like, I don't want to pay to have music. He wasn't even a big original music fan.
Yeah.
He was just a curmudgeon. And so it was an originals only club. You had to play original music only. The radio was never on. Yeah, he couldn't play the radio legally. He couldn't have anybody. If you started playing Happy Birthday, he would pull the plug on the stage. No covers whatsoever, which meant that we had to become an originals band because it was the only play, it was the one club that we could play at. So we started writing really early. There was a guy in town, Brad Knack, who had a solo project, and he needed a backup band for 2 songs, asked us if we would back him up. And as payment, he said we could record 2 of our own songs. And so we recorded 2 songs. It was at this place called Camp David It was basically a track tome with a studio, and
Oh, okay.
we were set up in bedrooms and living rooms,
Yeah.
and the studio was in the garage, and we recorded 2 songs just live in the studio. And we're like, that's fun. If we do 8 more, we'll have a record. And so we spent $600 recording and mixing our first record. That's Bread
Nice.
and Circus. And
Wow.
I would have been 17 at that point. And so a lot of those songs were written, Todd and I were writing those when I was 15. Yeah, it's weird. So our first record we did very early, very cheaply, recorded and mixed the whole thing in 48 hours. When we did Pale, we spent $6,000. And once again, recorded that one live in the studio, live lead vocals, everybody together, overdubbed like harmonies, and that was it.
From Bread and Circus to Pale to Fear, obviously Fear is the album where you guys just broke out and experienced a lot of success. How do you think you guys had developed as a band in that period, and maybe in particular you as a writer from, just between those 3 albums?
Well, I mean, we toured a lot. We put out, I think we put out Bread and Circus and Pale they were both completed when we got signed. We'd already put out Bread and Circus as a cassette in Santa Barbara.
Mhm.
We toured. It was this period of time where record companies had a lot of cash on hand,
Mhm.
because there was no streaming.
Right.
People were buying a cassette for the car,
Mhm.
a CD for their brand new CD player, and still often an LP. So like, people would have multiple copies of the same record instead of copying the record everywhere, right? And so they were cash flush at the time, which meant that they could invest in developing bands. And we were part of Donnie Einer's he was making a statement that Columbia was going to invest in new talent and
Mm.
do artist development and do
Yeah.
indie bands. And we were this California indie band
Mhm.
that he signed us and Poi Dog Pondering, I think, right about the same time. So we were this statement about, supporting and developing indie music. And part of our contract, honestly, we was, creative control. We could hand in the record that we wanted to hand in. I mean, it's funny, even our getting signed was kind of an accident. When we
Really?
were recording Pale, the producer was this guy, Marvin Etzioni. His manager, Ron Sobel, worked at ASCAP, the Performance Rights Association. Long story, all the names, but he gave it to this guy who worked at ASCAP named Nick Turzo, who was like 21 at the time. He later became an A&R guy. He signed like Alice in Chains and
Oh,
had a
wow.
great A&R career. But early on, he heard our tape and he started making cassette dubs in his office and sending them to A&R people. So we started getting calls. We hadn't sent out a demo. we were a local band, and the next thing we knew, we had like 8 offers from labels.
Really?
And our plan had been, like, we were making the Pale record, but our plan was we were going to sell it at local record stores and break up. And I was going to go to San Francisco. I'd been accepted. I wanted to be a high school teacher. I was accepted into the education program at
To teach drama, right? Is that right?
I wanted to teach like drama and social sciences. I was really into anthropology, sociology, and I'd already done a couple years. I started at City College in town when I was 16. And so I'd been studying music there, but I wanted to be a teacher. And so I was going to go to San Francisco. I was already looking at housing. And then instead we ended up, flying to New York and signing with Columbia,
Wow.
and never made it to the Bay Area. We were as surprised as anyone, and I think also assumed that it wouldn't last very long. And instead, it's taken up the last 35 years of my life.
And thankfully so. And that's really interesting that you guys were able to keep creative control. Was that common back then?
No, I mean, maybe we had leverage in that way because number one, we were kind of like, that was the chip we had on our shoulder. We
Mhm.
were like, hey, man, we're real. I mean, what's funny is we became, I think, the whipping boy for the idea that major labels were destroying indie music. Like
Oh, I see. Yeah.
we actually you know, Spin Magazine, whoever else, Tower Pulse. We were like the butt of the joke. The editorial essay at the beginning of every Tower Pulse magazine issue was that something about how awful we were. So what's funny about that is that when we were signing, we were very like, we're a real indie band. And, Geffen wanted us to take the best songs from the first 2 albums and re-record them so that we could have a hit. And we're like, we don't care about hits. We're an indie band. And so, we insist that you release the first 2 albums as is. We don't
Good
want
for
a hit.
you.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing was we didn't take, we did pretty small licensing fees for the first 2 albums. And we took recording advances only for Fear and Dulcinea, meaning we didn't take any money from the company to live on. Wow. We're like, we're going to earn we're going to earn every cent we make. So they paid to record the record, and we're like, we want to earn it. We're young. We can make this happen. We're going to tour our asses off. We worked really hard, and we thought it would be a fair deal that we would get paid when we earn money. And so that was how we paid for our artistic freedom. The funny thing about that is, we didn't see, it was when Dulcinea, so we'd already had a platinum record, and then it was right after Dulcinea went gold, we saw our first ever check from the record company.
Really?
Yeah.
What the heck?
So
is that because there was so much done in advance for the previous albums?
It's expensive to promote a record, and they spent a lot of money on those records. And
I see.
You're paying back every cent they spend on that out of your tiny percentage of what, I mean, they were in the black for a long time, but we didn't see a cent forever. That's how the accounting works on those things. And the funny thing is that's why for the Coil album, we're like, well, we should take a big advance. We're a multi-platinum artist, and we haven't been taking an advance, and we haven't been getting paid. So let's take it all up front. And as soon as we did that, what we didn't realize is if you take the money, then you get in trouble if you don't do what they want.
I see. Yeah.
So there was that. That was a lesson learned.
Well, it's interesting because I was reading some of the things that music critics were saying about you guys early on. And I know you've probably read this, but one of the early write-ups called you guys initially an REM clone, a little jangle in the guitars and some nice harmonies, but not much else. I'm like, ouch, that hurts.
Oh, it's about typical. That's not as bad as it got. Like I said, we were a punching bag for the press. I remember we hired for Dulcinea, we hired the woman who, I forget her name. She had been the one who rehabilitated John Mellencamp.
Oh, really?
And, brought him back from John Cougar.
Yeah.
And I remember her crying on the phone, like when her period was up, as our PR person, just saying that I didn't understand. They really, really hate you. They won't even listen to the record. I'm so sorry. But I also understand, well, the thing that happened that I think did that in the press was the All I Want video. I think we had some sympathy up until the All I Want video. And it looked a little too much like Losing My Religion.
Okay.
And I think it was seen as like, oh, here's the major, they're just cranking out, And it's the funny thing when you're the band, it's like, oh, we got to shoot a video. Okay, you're on tour. You get like 3 treatments, and you go like, this one, let's try it with this guy, and then you show up and you spend a day shooting, and then a week later, 2 weeks later, you get a cut, and that's what it is. Yeah. We weren't really savvy about thinking of how we were visually presented. I don't know. It was also that we had a hit, that we were on top 40 radio. It was this period where radio was really open, and it wasn't okay for an indie identified college band to have a hit, right? That was the time where, like, you think of Pearl Jam or Counting Crows, like disfiguring their singles or refusing to even play them. That attitude where you didn't want to be like, you were on a major label, but you wanted to pretend you were above that and that you didn't actually want some success. And I think it was honestly held. It was these bands that loathed the mainstream, but found themselves in the mainstream.
Right.
And it's part of why it was such a competitively edgy time, right? Like, This idea that if you had something real to say, you would be saying it with a snarl and a growl and a shout. That saying it quietly, I think it was Elliott Smith that kind of single-handedly brought quiet despair back to indie music. But
He
you
died
know,
way too young, man.
he did. But that period was a very strange one. You wanted people to hear you, but it had to be cool people in the right way. And we were really terrible at marketing. We didn't believe in marketing. And I honestly think we used to believe like, well, REM, like we would talk about REM, and that was great about REM is they didn't have an image, man. People are talking about how you image yourself. They don't have one. They just show up as they are. And I think we realized years later that they did show up as they are, but also Michael Stipe is an incredibly visual artist. And he really did have a great understanding of how a band should portray itself, how the art should look, how the image of the band, the look and feel of what you put out affects how people will perceive it. And we just thought they kind of rolled out of bed arty. and we weren't that arty, so we rolled out of bed nerdy, and it was not okay to be nerdy.
I love that. That's funny. Rolled out of bed nerdy. That's me every day. But it wasn't all bad, because I was reading this about Dulcinea. It says Dulcinea is Toad the Wet Sprocket's shining masterpiece. Every song is great, and every song flows into the other amazingly well. It weaves musical themes and musical sounds so perfectly. It is pure sweetness to the listener's ears.
That's awesome. What year was that written?
That was when Dulcinea came out. So what was that?
Really?
95? Yeah, it was in one of the Chicago newspapers. So
see, I concentrate on the negative. That's great.
But did that affect you guys back then to read some of that stuff? I mean, obviously, you get the praise on one hand.
Well, as you can tell, I was only looking at the criticism. I obsess on it, right? And this is why, like, I'm sure in the interview where you heard me talking about wanting to be a teacher, like, I wanted to be a teacher because I wanted to be in the arts, but I didn't want to be publicly humiliated because I knew it would kind of wreck my mind and my heart, and it did. And my feeling of being a fraud, and that the critics were seeing who I really was, and the people who liked it weren't getting it. That was really intense for me. I massive imposter syndrome. And so I was not good at saying fuck the critics. I was my heart was ripped open by them. So it's good to hear actually the Dulcinea thing. I need to be reminded, because I know that people who heard the music and identified with us liked us. I tell a story, once again, victim story though. I tell the story in my own head that people liked us, but all the people who, quote unquote, mattered in the press and in the larger world hated us. And it's not necessarily even a true story, right? You just quoted a good, this is me talking about the danger of these stories. So they're not entirely true. I put an undue emphasis, like the bad reviews I would obsess over. When they were scathing, they were pretty scathing. I mean, part of the thing about that time is people were so competitively edgy, right? Everything was supposed to be about being gnarly, and we weren't. And we were a lot more vulnerable. And, there'd be a song like I Will Not Take These Things for Granted that in indie world was like not cool, right? But it touched people. And I think considering who we were, where we came from, we were speaking to a group of people that a lot of the other popular music at that moment wasn't necessarily speaking to. And our goal was to try to, no matter what we did, remain authentic. And I mean, you asked once again with the Fear album, I think part of that was we didn't know if we'd ever get a budget again, ever. So my favorite records, going away from criticism and the way I beat myself up with that, it's a stupid sob story. Making that record, you had asked earlier, I think we all wanted to try making a big record. I loved like songs from The Big Chair. I loved Talk Talk. I loved Talk Talk records. I loved Peter Gabriel. I loved big, big dramatic records. And we wanted to make a record that had that like breadth and scope. And production value to it. And once again, we didn't know if we'd ever get to do it again. So we figured we'd throw in everything. And going from 2 records that were essentially live in the studio, it was a big difference, right? And when we went to Dulcinea, we were kind of the opposite. We were like, we'd made this big record, but we wanted a record that sounded, we'd had a friend out. My friend Bruce was playing keyboards for us, and we wanted a record that was 5 people, basically a thing that a 5-piece could pull off live with nothing extra. Gotcha. We wanted it to sound as big as the live show sounded, but not miss anything when we were on the road for it.
Fear is immensely cinematic, and so I mean, if your goal was to make this large album, I mean, you guys really nailed it. I mean, it's such an incredible album. To me, every song on there is so special. To me, I remember going out and buying the CD and wearing it out, and even at work, we'd have the radio on, and I remember one time Walk on the Ocean came on, and we're all singing along and trying to figure out what your guy's name meant and everything. And we get to the end of the song, and there's the chorus comes back on. I'm like, what the heck? Where did that extra chorus come from?
Oh, the radio version. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you guys play it live, you don't play the extra chorus, right? You kind of go with the original take of it.
Well, yeah, that was, a radio, that was just a record company consideration, right?
Gotcha.
When we play it live now, we come back in on the chorus so people can sing along because it's a short song. Once again, it had the cold ending, and it's like, nope, got to end with the chorus. So we did the radio edit.
That was the indie ending,
Yeah, it was the indie ending. And we had huge arguments with the record company about remix. We were difficult. It's like, we're not going to remix it. It sounds exactly what we like, But, we ended up doing remixes for everything. It was fine. Michael Brower mixed it. He did a great job. But we were assholes about it.
You were artists. You were standing up for your art. I get that. I can appreciate that.
Yeah, there's standing up for your art. I think there's also understanding the nature of the beast. And I think because we didn't have, we had the ambition of making good music, and we worked hard. I mean, we played more than 300 shows for the Fear Tour. We toured our asses off.
Wow.
18 months, 300 shows. And we worked really hard, but I think also we were at the same time pretty entitled because we got signed easily. Most bands, it has to be the only thing you want out of life for that to happen.
Yeah.
And so there was this odd, I think the head of the company never understood that I didn't want to be a superstar. And he kept where's the ambition? And I didn't have the ambition. I had a really hard time with being in the spotlight, and that didn't make any sense to them.
As a front man, they're like, no, you should want the spotlight. I could see that, but you're focused. I want to make music that I love, and they wanted you to be this, whatever. And so I could see where that tension would exist.
Yeah, it was a strange and strained relationship.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, and then, to end that album on I Will Not Take These Things for Granted, to me, it's definitely one of my favorites. Did it surprise you that became such a fan favorite? And for the record, this is how slow I am. It wasn't until within the last year that I realized the song doesn't rhyme, which I greatly appreciate, because I think there are, like America by Simon & Garfunkel doesn't rhyme. I love the fact that you kind of broke out of the rhyming convention. But anyway, going back to my first question, did it surprise you that song became such a fan favorite? Because it is. Everybody loves that song.
Yeah, it was a hard song to get off the ground, even with the band. Because I'm not the greatest guitar. I remember bringing it in, and people were like, "What?" It took a lot of work to get the arrangement together and to get the mood of it right. It's all in the title, right? It's it's a pretty damn universal sentiment, and an important one. If you can hit something like that and hit it with the proper tone, it resonates with people.
Yeah.
And so, and probably weird. I mean, I was a weird kid, right? So at 20 to be writing about gratitude,
I love it.
And not because I had it worked out, but
Mhm.
because I think I was also realizing I had a lot of entitlement, and it doesn't come easy. Gratitude is I think a constant practice. I just think, psychologically, neurologically, we normalize comfort. There's this feeling that when things are good and easy, especially when they're easy, that is the new normal, and we kind of acclimate. We set our scale for what we expect according to our comfort level, and the more comfortable we are, the more we think that comfort is really normal, and then we're terribly disappointed when life intervenes with that. And as the most comfortable generation of human beings ever to exist, I think we have to fight more and more, and even purposefully put ourselves in uncomfortable situations.
Yeah.
It's gratitude is difficult to come by, and it's not like, how can I say this? It's I think the existence of extreme privileges, to me, is something I would describe as sinful. Meaning,
Mm.
for instance, living in the richest country on earth, where we have increasingly high rates of poverty, we can't get national medical care. That so many people are desperate in a country that has so much wealth, I think is absolutely a moral failing at every level. Entitlement is nasty business, and incredibly common, and has to be fought against. I don't know, when we start thinking we're entitled to it, when we start thinking we deserve it, or did something, or have some innate worth that means we should have more than the people around us,
Mm.
that's when you get into some really dangerous territory. There's no reason that anyone should be starving in this country, except that we've chosen to give it all to the people on top.
And you see that, 52-year-old Glenn sees that now, but to be able to write a song like that at 20, that's, or whatever, how old you were when you wrote that, to not take really some simple and beautiful things for granted, for you to get that at that age. I know I wouldn't have those thoughts when I was 20. I think that's pretty remarkable.
I guess I don't have a social media person, but Toad does, and our social media person was going to do a post that was this excerpt of an interview that I did for Bread and Circus, and I had to like ask her not to put it up there because I read it and I'm like, oh my god, I am so unbearably pretentious. Like, oh, I was just cringing reading myself, and the person saying, "Wow, these are deep thoughts for a 19-year-old," and I'm like, "Yeah, well, I'm really intense." It was just so terrible to listen to. My family, I grew up with two PhD scientists. My mom was deeply involved in politics in town. My father, he was an optical physicist, but kind of his sideline was he was really interested in non-Western spirituality. So he was giving me the Tao Te Ching, taking me to Zen meditation courses, books by like my children's books that I remember are like Idris Shah, the Nasruddin books, which he's a Sufi writer, and our conversation at our table was basically, and I realized this later, was everything that you're not supposed to talk about at anyone else's dinner table. So it was politics and religion and philosophy. Like, I don't know, it makes sense to me that I was thinking about those things and
Yeah.
talking about those things at that age. There's a bit of that if I look back on it and see the way I talked about it, it was like not I would rate it as enthusiastically pretentious for the most part, and not necessarily very nuanced or well considered, but I'm also not embarrassed that was my I like that was my subject matter, even if I was handling it kind of
Yeah.
ham-fistedly. I mean, later in life, and I think it's the weird thing, like thinking about grief, thinking about gratitude, thinking about what a spiritual life outside of the confines of religion and dogma is. I mean, all of those things are stuff that has aged well with me in terms of the questions I get to ask. I mean, and you know, it's like there's the Rilke quote of, you know, live the questions, right? It's not about finding the answers. Because when you get to the meaning of life, when you get to God, when you get to what is the soul, the spirit, what is this all about? There's no answer at all. Never an answer. There's just more questions. And like learning to really love the mystery of that and love the exploration of that is, you know, lasts, it'll get you through a lifetime.
When Dulcinea came out, would you consider that somewhat of a nod to your early days in theater? Because obviously there's you know, Windmills, the reference to Don Quixote. I think Dulcinea, isn't that what Don Quixote called his his love interest? Do I
Yeah, it
remember
was
that
kind of
correctly?
his imaginary love interest.
Okay, yeah, it's been so long since I've seen Man of La Mancha, but was that kind of a nod to your love for theater, kind of that little bit of a theme there running through that album?
Wasn't Man of La Mancha. Randy had read Don Quixote while we were on tour, so
Oh,
he was
okay.
talking about it. So I basically, our drummer Randy was the intellectual of the bunch, and he read Don Quixote, and we were talking about just that idea of where the love interest is a fiction, right?
Mm.
And you know, these illusions that we kind of, you know, lean towards and make real. And so there was a little debate about whether it should have been Dulcinea or Rocinante, which was his horse. It was his.
After Coil, you know, you guys called it a day as a band for a while. Kind of what led up to that? Did you guys kind of feel like you'd run your course? Or hi everyone, this conversation with Glen is so open and insightful, and I did not want to leave any important portions on the editing room floor, so I split it in two. Tune into part 2, which will be released in a few weeks on April 17th, 2023. In part 2, Glen gives an open and honest account of what led to Toad's breakup and how the band was able to recalibrate dynamics and find joy in playing together again. He also talks about what the future holds for the band. We also chat about embracing grief and what we can learn from the old folks' home and singing to no audience. And Glen shares what has killed many of his songs before they were written. We also dive into Glen's wonderful solo career and play a beautiful song from his latest solo album. You will not want to miss part 2 of this up-close and personal chat with Glen Phillips, so keep your bags packed and join us again as we continue this journey to the stage.